Historically, management scholarship focused almost exclusively inwards, obsessing over internal efficiencies, structures, operations. Organizations were largely treated as these sort of self-contained machines.
Apart perhaps from the basic forces of market competition, it was very internal.
Exactly. But then, starting significantly in the 1950s, general systems theory introduced a truly radical, almost destabilizing idea.
The idea that the organization isn't an island, right?
Precisely. It exists within this external supersystem, which we universally call the environment.
And that shift was genuinely revolutionary for organizational theory. It forced scholars, really, to stop focusing purely on design and bureaucracy.
And start looking outwards.
Yes, grappling with external forces, complex organizational fields, the dynamics of entire populations of organizations. So our mission today is quite academic, quite rigorous.
A comprehensive synthesis.
Exactly. How organizations survive, how they thrive within this external complexity. We need to move chronologically, conceptually too, navigating from those objective, measurable definitions of the early modernists.
The sort of hard facts approach.
Through the symbolic perspectives, where the environment is institutionalized or even, enacted by how managers see things.
And finally, engaging with the critical postmodern critiques. Sustainability, stakeholder rights.
That's the full picture. We are aiming to synthesize 4 core analytical frameworks: contingency theory, resource dependence theory, population ecology, and institutional theory.
Okay, let's unpack this. For you, the listener, this means by the end of this deep dive, you'll have, hopefully, a complete multi-lens theoretical toolkit.
Enabling you to define and rigorously analyze pretty much any organizational environment you encounter.
Whether it's fast-moving competitive markets or, say, tightly regulated, state-controlled fields.
Indeed. And to understand influence, we have to start with definition. So let's begin with the fundamentals, firmly rooted in that modern objective perspective.
Okay, so in the modern tradition, the environment is conceived quite cleanly, conceptually at least. It's seen as an objective entity.
Basically, everything that lies entirely outside the organization's established boundary.
Right. And this external supersystem is fundamentally transactional, isn't it? It supplies inputs.
Raw materials, capital, labor, all the necessaries.
And then it absorbs the outputs. Products, services, even waste.
But what's immediately fascinating here, even with that seemingly simple definition, everything outside, is that the organizational boundary itself is actually notoriously difficult, quite tricky to define.
It's not a solid line on a map.
Not at all. The decision of what's inside and what remains outside is rarely fixed. It depends entirely on the purpose of your analysis at that moment. The boundary is an analytical tool, you see, not some physical wall.
That's a really crucial distinction. Let's take that specific example from the source material.
Yeah.
A university, that makes it clear.
Okay.
So if the leadership is analyzing the environment because they're thinking about a tuition increase,
A common scenario.
then they'd be strategically wise to consider students as customers, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. Students are the recipients. Their reaction, protest, leaving determines the financial outcome.
Right.
So they are external, affecting the bottom line.
But flip the situation. Imagine the university is submitting a major grant application.
Right. To an outside funding body.
In that context, defining students as members of the organization suddenly makes sense.
It allows the application to say how they will benefit from the research, the new facilities. They become an internal asset, strengthening the case for funding.
Rather than an external cost center. Or, one more, a program evaluation. Viewing students as the products makes sense there. It helps assess if the environment, the job market perhaps, is accepting the university's output. It frames the boundary around the process itself.
The key takeaway for any manager or analyst then is that this boundary is fluid. It's molded by the intent of the analysis and, crucially, the audience you're performing that analysis for.
Okay, so moving past that immediate boundary challenge, the modern perspective organizes environmental analysis into 3 distinct, sort of nested levels of focus.
A hierarchy to manage the complexity.
First, the immediate actors and relationships, stakeholders and the interorganizational networks they form.
Your immediate playing field.
Second, the broader context. Conditions and trends within the environmental sectors.
The bigger picture forces.
And finally, the largest frame, the global environment, which emerges from all the complex interactions among these smaller subsystems.
That hierarchy is absolutely vital for structuring complexity. And we start at the coalface, as it were, stakeholders.
The critical actors, individuals, groups, other organizations.
That engage with your organization.
Right.
to secure resources, sell products, get knowledge. Now, the literature gives us two definitions here.
Right, there's a narrow one.
Focusing only on actors vital to survival or success. Your core suppliers, key customers, regulators.
But there's also a more inclusive definition, which seems much more relevant today.
Increasingly demanded, yes. It requires considering every actor affected by the organization's activities. Local communities, NGOs, the general public, even future generations sometimes.
And these relationships among stakeholders, they don't exist in a vacuum. They form the inter-organizational network.
Which we can visualize, can't we? Nodes are the actors, links are the channels.
Channels for resources, information, influence.
And network analysis gives us sophisticated, measurable variables to assess these relationships. This provides management with genuine insight into the power dynamics.
So what are we measuring?
Well, first, we look at centrality. This quantifies influence. It's often measured by the size, number, and weight of links or ties connecting to a particular organizational node.
So a big node means more influence.
Generally, yes. Greater structural influence within the network. We also measure network density. That's the sheer concentration of links across the entire system.
What does high density tell us?
Well, it's excellent for rapid information flow, solidarity, building trust, but it can also stifle innovation, create groupthink, or make the whole network vulnerable if one central node fails. Systemic risk.
But I find the concept of the structural whole much more compelling, strategically speaking.
Ah, yes, the gaps.
It's the absence of links in a particular area of the network. This absence pinpoints potential gaps, which in turn represent opportunities.
Opportunities for a well-positioned actor to bridge that information gap, perhaps. Act as a broker.
Exactly. Or exert control over the flow of resources. The actor who fills or bridges that structural hole enjoys information arbitrage, real strategic advantage.
A prime application of this network thinking, especially in business, is the supply chain.
The linear flow.
Yes, focusing on that linear flow of raw materials or resources, from basic supply, say lithium extraction,
Through intermediate organizations, refiners, manufacturers.
right through to the end users. And where the focus shifts to value-added activities, especially in services, we talk about the value chain.
But the managerial objective is similar, isn't it?
Always similar. Promote efficiency, get the advantages of division of labor among partners, but without incurring all the administrative costs and bureaucracy of full internal integration into one giant firm.
Okay, moving now to the second level of analysis.
Yeah.
Because tracking immediate stakeholder networks, while vital, is never enough for a comprehensive view.
Absolutely not. You need to track conditions and trends in the macro environment.
And to do this systematically, the modern view carves the environment into the 7 environmental sectors. This is where we capture those broader external forces hitting the entire field.
And let's really emphasize their interconnectedness. Understanding how they interact is arguably more important than just memorizing the list.
Good point. Let's run through them. First, the social sector.
This covers broad human dimensions: demographics, aging populations, migration, class structure, mobility patterns, large social movements.
Like environmentalism or demands for diversity and inclusion.
Exactly. These shift consumer demands, create workforce challenges, and fundamentally change internal organizational structures and even reporting requirements.
Okay. Next is the cultural sector.
This deals with shared history, traditions, core values, beliefs, normative expectations within a society.
For example.
Well, in many Western firms, think about the significant ongoing trend of decreasing value placed on rigid hierarchical authority.
Compared to, say, 50 years ago.
Definitely. And alongside that, an increasing value placed on ethical business practices, transparency, human rights accountability. These cultural shifts inevitably intersect with the legal and political domains.
Which leads us neatly to the legal sector. This is defined by constitutions, statutes, regulations.
Antitrust laws, tax codes, intellectual property law, employment law, all the rules of the game.
But legal trends are rarely isolated, are they? You mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley earlier.
A perfect example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the U.S., enacted after major scandals like Enron.
To expose corruption, enforce stricter financial accountability.
That was clearly a legal mechanism, yes, but it was driven by intense political pressure reacting to deep economic failures and a cultural desire for greater transparency and ethical behavior. They're all linked.
Then the political sector. This addresses the distribution of power, political systems, dominant ideologies.
Think about the impact of the renunciation of communist rule in Eastern Europe in 1989. Huge shifts.
Or political alliances like the EU or NAFTA.
Critically important. These alliances erode traditional national autonomy, don't they? They favor supporting transnational trade flows, which often blurs the line directly with the economic sector.
So the economic sector, this includes financial markets, fiscal policies, interest rates, inflation.
Ownership structures, too. Think about trends like privatization of formerly state-run hospitals or airlines. The economic environment dictates the flow and cost of capital, resources, labor. It's a fundamental constraint on what organizations can do.
Then we have the technology sector. This provides knowledge, information, scientific developments, new applications.
Things like AI, additive manufacturing, sophisticated genetics, CAD/CAM systems. The list is endless and constantly changing.
And technology often intertwines critically with law, as we see now with AI and data privacy.
Absolutely. Digitalization, for instance, created huge threats to intellectual property rights software, pirating, forcing legislative changes in the legal sector. But it also demands high levels of coordination across the economic sector to manage global digital supply chains.
Right. And finally, the physical sector.
This involves natural resources and the profound effects of nature itself.
So access to resources like oil or water, harbors, but also pollution levels, climate change, severe weather events.
Exactly. And while many physical changes, like earthquakes, are hard to predict, their impact can trigger massive cascading effects across the whole system.
Give us an example of that cascade.
Okay, a major earthquake, a purely physical event, can immediately generate heightened public concern about building safety. That's a cultural trend shift.
Which then leads to demands for
changes in building codes. That's the legal sector stepping in.
which in turn stimulates.
The development of new seismic-proof building materials and techniques. That's the technical sector responding. It shows the deep interdependence.
That systemic interdependence across these 7 sectors really is the essence of modern environmental complexity. We see it vividly today with artificial intelligence, as you mentioned.
Definitely. The technology sector advances rapidly.
Forcing the legal and political sectors to scramble with regulation on data privacy, liability, bias.
Driven by cultural shifts around trust and ethics.
All while the economic sector is grappling with the huge impact on jobs and productivity, it touches everything.
And this leads us seamlessly to the highest level of analysis. Globalization.
Which is more than just countries trading, isn't it?
Much more. Traditionally, internationalization just meant organizations interacting across fixed national borders. That generated complexity, sure.
And regionalization, like NAFTA.
That involves governments sponsoring formal agreements. NAFTA provided specific benefits, like special tariff status for Mexican maquiladoras exporting goods. It structures cross-border activity.
But globalization itself is far more profound.
It is. It's the convergence of conditions and trends across all sectors, rendering existing national borders permeable, sometimes almost irrelevant.
Creating multiplying interdependencies, organizations, networks, sectors, all interacting on a global scale. The scope is enormous.
Think about the tangible examples. The economic sector sees global capital markets, huge transnational corporations operating everywhere.
The political and legal spheres confront the erosion of the nation-state's traditional authority.
As global bodies like the UN, the WTO gain influence, sometimes clashing with national interests.
And the physical sector confronts universal threats like climate change, biodiversity loss.
Threats that completely ignore political boundaries.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The paradox of globalization itself.
The homogenization versus fragmentation tension.
Exactly. While globalization often fosters cultural homogenization, English is the language of business. Global brands, fast food, jeans everywhere.
It often drives a really strong counter-trend, as local customs and distinct identities feel threatened or eroded.
This triggers a forceful assertion of communal affiliation, religious fundamentalism, nationalism.
Powerful appeals for self-determination. So globalization simultaneously demands diversity appreciation while, ironically, contributing to significant global conflict and fragmentation.
It's a complex picture.
In short, analyzing the environment objectively from this modern perspective requires tracking material resources, mapping powerful stakeholders, monitoring these 7 interconnected macro sectors, and acknowledging the multi-layered complexities of global interdependence. It ensures management is at least aware of the comprehensive risks and opportunities out there.
Okay, so now we move from simply defining that objective environment to asking the core modern question. How does this environment actually influence, or in some cases, determine the optimal organizational form and strategy for survival?
And we start with environmental contingency theory. This is closely associated with scholars like Burns and Stocker and later Lawrence and Lorsch.
That's right, and the fundamental premise is quite straightforward, almost deterministic in its early forms.
The idea that the environment dictates the best structure.
Essentially, yes. The characteristics of the environment dictate the most effective organizational structure. The best form is contingent on external conditions.
So what are the main forms?
Well, in stable environments, the theory suggests the mechanistic form works best. High formalization, strict hierarchy, centralized decisions.
Exactly. Maximizing efficiency through standard procedures, optimization, routine. Think classic bureaucracy.
But when environments are rapidly changing or highly complex,
The advantages of that rigidity collapse. Here, the organic form is seen as better adapted,
flexible, low formalization, decentralized, innovative.
better suited for rapid organizational adaptation and learning.
And the key variable explaining which form works best, according to the early contingency theorists, was environmental uncertainty.
Yes, and they define this uncertainty objectively as the interaction between two factors:
Complexity.
the sheer number and diversity of external elements the organization has to track,
And rate of change.
how fast those elements are moving or shifting. So high complexity combined with rapid change equals high objective uncertainty.
But that objective view got complicated, didn't it?
It did. A major empirical critique quickly emerged. Objective uncertainty measured out there was often less predictive of the actual organizational form than perceptual uncertainty.
How managers experience it, how they interpret the environment.
Precisely. This realization led to the information theory of uncertainty. This basically posits that managers experience uncertainty when they lack the necessary information to make sound decisions. It's about the information gap.
That distinction feels crucial. Can you break down the levels of uncertainty from an information perspective?
Sure. Low uncertainty occurs when the information needed is known and readily available. Stable, simple conditions.
Okay.
Moderate uncertainty arises either from an overload of information, too much data to process, or from constantly changing data streams.
Right.
But high uncertainty is reached when managers face an overwhelming, constantly changing data stream, and crucially, they don't even know what information is needed to proceed. The scale becomes impossible to comprehend.
Like that example you gave, trying to analyze all of YouTube or global financial transactions for strategy.
Exactly. The required information cannot even be properly defined, let alone gathered and processed. It's paralyzing.
So how do organizations cope with this perceived complexity?
Well, this challenge led to concepts like requisite variety and isomorphism. The law of requisite variety comes from cybernetics.
Okay.
It states that for any system to manage complexity effectively, it must possess the same or greater internal complexity than the system it seeks to manage or control.
So complexity demands complexity.
Essentially, yes. Therefore, successful organizations must match their perceived environmental complexity with their internal structures. This drive towards matching is called isomorphism.
And Lawrence and Lorsch specifically linked this to structure.
They did. They argued that complex environments favor internal differentiation, creating specialized units, departments, roles to handle specific environmental demands, R&D for technology, marketing for customers, legal for regulations.
But all that specialization creates coordination problems internally.
Precisely. And that resulting internal complexity necessitates sophisticated integration mechanisms. High-level managerial coordination, cross-functional teams, complex rules and procedures to hold it all together.
Okay, now let's shift to a drastically different modern focus, resource dependence theory.
A very influential perspective, powerfully articulated by Pfeffer and Solancic in their book, The External Control of Organizations.
And this theory rejects the idea that managers should just focus internally on efficiency.
Completely. Instead, it looks intensely at the organization level, specifically at the power and dependence relationships within that interorganizational network we discussed earlier.
The core argument seems quite simple and pragmatic.
It is. Organizations depend on the environment for critical resources, raw materials, labor, capital, knowledge, you name it.
And this unavoidable dependence
Grants the external environment power over the organization. If a supplier controls a critical resource you need, that supplier can exert influence. They can make demands higher prices, specific contract terms.
So managerial action has to focus on mitigating that power imbalance, managing the dependency.
Exactly. Managers must prioritize these dependencies. They need to assess two key factors for each resource relationship. How important is the resource? Is it absolutely essential, like rare earth minerals for a tech manufacturer? Or is it easily substitutable, like office stationery?
And scarcity.
What's the risk of not getting it? How difficult is it to obtain? Think about access to fresh water in drought-prone regions versus something abundant.
And resources that are both scarce and critical.
Demand the most intense managerial effort and strategy. That's where the real vulnerability lies.
So what can managers do about it? How do they fight back, so to speak?
The managerial response is to develop countervailing power to offset the dependence. There are several strategies.
Like
establishing multiple sources of supply, obviously, don't rely on just one. Using sophisticated contracting and tight control within supply chain management.
more aggressive actions.
Yes, vertical integration, buying your suppliers or distributors. Or horizontal integration, merging with competitors to concentrate buying power or market access.
What about non-market dependencies like regulations?
Organizations manage those too, through lobbying, funding industry, trade associations to influence policy, playing the political game.
And in the worst-case scenario, if a dependency is just too crippling,
They might try to escape it entirely by changing their domain, exiting certain lines of business, diversifying into new product areas where dependencies are lower. It's about strategic maneuvering.
this theory definitely emphasizes managerial agency, doesn't it? The idea that organizations can actively shape and manipulate their environment.
Very much so. It assumes managers can make strategic choices to alter their position.
But now we encounter a completely different modern perspective. Population ecology theory.
Yes, this shifts the focus entirely away from the individual organization and its managers.
It looks at the environment level.
Precisely. It examines patterns of success and failure across a whole population of competing organizations operating within a shared resource pool, what ecologists call an ecological niche.
So it's like Darwinism for organizations.
That's the core divergence, exactly. While resource dependence says managers act strategically to influence things, population ecology applies purely Darwinian principles. It sees the individual organization as largely passive, often unable to adapt quickly enough to fundamental environmental shifts.
And the dynamics are explained by this three-stage process.
Variation, selection, and retention.
Okay, break that down for us.
Variation occurs constantly, either through entrepreneurial innovation where completely new organizational forms emerge,
Like the first ride-sharing apps.
or through minor adaptations and changes by established firms trying to keep up. This provides the environment with a rich pool of diverse organizational forms to choose from.
Then comes selection.
This is the crucial, often brutal step. The unforgiving environment selects by providing resources, customers, legitimacy, only those organizations that best fit its current needs or demands.
And non-selection means.
Decline, resource starvation, eventual failure, or perhaps a painful flight to a different, less competitive niche if possible.
And finally, retention.
This is the continuous flow of resources, profits, members, funding that ensures short-term survival for the fittest organizations, those selected by the environment. But even this success isn't static. It drives pressure for further variation and innovation just to maintain that competitive edge against newcomers or adapting rivals.
If this theory feels highly deterministic, it really challenges that heroic manager assumption we saw in resource dependence.
It does. It places the power squarely with the environment as the selecting agent.
But this theory also gets critique, doesn't it? Mainly for a kind of logical circularity.
Exactly. The central critique is often the tautology.
It explains survival by fitness.
But fitness is ultimately defined only by survival itself. You can only really identify which organization was the fittest after the fact of selection. It's explanatory after the event, less predictive beforehand.
And it doesn't apply everywhere equally.
Right. It applies most readily to highly competitive populations with lots of similar organizations and relatively low barriers to entry and exit, think restaurants or small retail shops. It's less useful, perhaps, for analyzing heavily capital-intensive, slow-changing sectors like pharmaceuticals or aerospace or defense contracting, where a few large players dominate and individual strategic decisions have massive, long-lasting impacts.
Still, it's invaluable for explaining those broad industry dynamics, isn't it? Why certain types of organizations rise and fall over time, the inevitable mortality rates.
Absolutely. It provides a powerful lens on macro-level competitive dynamics, even if it offers less direct advice to individual managers.
Okay, now we make a fundamental transition. We're moving away from the modern idea of an objective, measurable reality out there.
We enter the realm of the symbolic perspective. Here, the environment isn't just a source of physical resources or competitive threats.
It's seen as a social construction.
Exactly, based on shared symbolism, collective beliefs, and cultural expectations. This shift acknowledges the absolutely critical role of human values, shared meanings, and social interpretation in organizational survival.
And this is where institutional theory comes in.
Precisely. It provides a powerful counterpoint, particularly to resource dependence theory. Institutionalists argue that organizations rely not just on material resources, cash, labor, machines,
but on social legitimacy.
yes. This is the acceptance, the validation, the perceived appropriateness of an organization by the surrounding societies, communities, and key institutional actors like governments, professional bodies, influential media.
And a lack of legitimacy.
Can be just as lethal, if not more so, than a lack of capital. An organization seen as illegitimate will struggle to attract resources, customers, employees, and may face sanctions.
The theory makes a distinction, then, between two types of environmental demands the organization faces.
It does. Two crucial types. First, the familiar technical or economic demands.
Rewarding efficiency, producing good services effectively.
Right.
The stuff resource dependence focuses on.
Right. But second, and this is key for institutional theory, are the social, cultural, legal, and political demands.
And these reward
Conformity. Conformity to the values, norms, rules, and beliefs upheld by powerful social institutions. Often, regardless of whether that conformity improves immediate economic efficiency or not, it's about playing the expected societal role.
And the result of these pervasive social pressures is institutional isomorphism.
Yes, isomorphism again, but with a different driver. Here, it means the powerful tendency for organizations operating within the same institutional field, say banking or higher education or healthcare, to adopt strikingly similar structures or practices.
Not necessarily because they're the most efficient, but
Primarily to gain or maintain legitimacy, to look like a proper, acceptable player in that field. This is why, as you look across industries, organizations within them often look remarkably similar on paper, even if their day-to-day activities differ quite a lot.
And this pressure for similarity comes in three main forms, identified by DiMaggio and Powell.
That's the classic typology. First, coercive pressure.
This sounds straightforward.
Yeah.
Laws and regulations.
Exactly. Formal regulations, laws, governmental mandates. Think environmental protection legislation, financial disclosure laws like Sarbanes-Oxley, or the EU's GDPR. Compliance is essentially mandatory for survival and legitimacy in most sectors.
Okay. Second type.
Normative pressure. This arises from cultural values and professional expectations.
Driven by things like education.
Very much so. Think about how standardized MBA curricula ensure that managers globally tend to understand the same corporate jargon, use similar frameworks, and subscribe to broadly similar professional ethics.
Or broader societal beliefs.
Yes, like the growing expectation that corporations should publicly support diversity initiatives or environmental sustainability goals. These aren't laws necessarily, but strong normative expectations.
And finally, the most interesting one, perhaps, mimetic pressure.
Mimetic means imitation, copying. This involves organizations copying successful or highly legitimate organizations in their field, adopting what's perceived as best practice.
Especially when things are uncertain.
That's the key condition. When the market is volatile, technology is changing fast, or the future is confusing, firms often adopt a template, a structure, or a strategy that seems to have worked for a prominent, successful peer.
Even if they don't fully understand why it worked for the other organization.
Sometimes, yes, it provides a legitimizing, safe structure. It signals to stakeholders, we know what we're doing, we're following the leaders. It reduces perceived risk and uncertainty, even if the copied practice isn't objectively optimal for their specific situation.
And this conformity, whether coercive, normative, or mimetic, wins social support.
Which is critical for survival, as we said. Even if the adopted structures are purely ceremonial, just for show, and don't actually improve performance much or at all.
This leads to the idea of institutional myths.
Yes. Widely accepted beliefs, procedures, or structures that become taken for granted as the right way to do things, justifying their existence regardless of objective performance outcomes.
Like
elaborate accountability reporting systems that generate mountains of paperwork but achieve only superficial transparency. Or the persistent belief, particularly in finance, that certain institutions are simply too big to fail, justifying massive public bailouts. These myths confer legitimacy.
But the ultimate test of legitimacy comes when it's lost, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Public outrage against unethical behavior or widespread deception. Think Enron, WorldCom. the global financial crisis, various environmental disasters caused by corporate negligence.
These scandals demonstrate that delegitimization can swiftly threaten or outright destroy even powerful organizations.
It underscores the vital importance of maintaining that social acceptance, often placing it above purely short-term economic rationality. Legitimacy is a critical resource.
Okay. Now for our second symbolic framework, which you described as perhaps the most radical.
Yeah.
Enactment theory.
Yes, pioneered particularly by Carl Weick. This view completely flips the modernist script. It doesn't see the environment as something out there to be objectively analyzed.
Understood.
It posits that organizational analysis and the process of sense-making don't just reflect a pre-existing reality. They actively create the environment to which the organization subsequently responds.
Wait, so decision makers act on their perceptions?
And in doing so, they enact the very complexity and reality they imagine they are just observing.
So you're saying the complexity and uncertainty we experience isn't just objectively out there hitting us, it's at least partially self-inflicted. That seems counterintuitive.
It is fundamentally counterintuitive, which is why it's such a powerful idea. Enactment theory argues that much of the complexity and uncertainty managers perceive arises from the organization's own efforts to monitor, interpret, and control the environment.
How does that work?
When decision makers perceive a complex environment, what do? They gather more data, they create more sophisticated measurement systems, they hire more experts, they hold more meetings.
Which, in turn,
enacts an ever-growing, more complex and more uncertain reality that they then feel compelled to manage. They essentially organize the chaos they have helped to create through their attempts to understand it. The act of observing changes the observed.
a fascinating feedback loop. A corollary to enactment is the concept of equivocality.
Yes. This happens when humans, in trying to make sense of ambiguous situations, actually multiply the perceived possibilities and potential interpretations. They end up enacting contradictory realities simultaneously.
Which links closely to ambiguity. You mentioned March and Olson.
Indeed. James March and Johann Olson, influential organizational scholars, argued that organizational ambiguity isn't always a problem to be solved. It can actually be a strategic tool.
A tool? How?
As a means of suspending the relentless rational imperatives towards consistency and clear goals. Ambiguity allows organizations to explore alternative, sometimes conflicting purposes or identities without making premature commitments or shutting down possibilities too early.
And Eric Eisenberg expanded on this with strategic ambiguity.
Yes. He described how managers sometimes purposely omit specific contextual cues in their communication. In vision statements, goal setting, they keep things a bit vague.
Why would they do that?
To encourage multiple, often benign interpretations among different groups within the organization, this can lead to what he called unified diversity.
Unified diversity.
People can subscribe to the same broad organizational purpose or vision, but they interpret it in ways that fit their specific roles or tasks, allowing them to pursue highly differentiated methods or priorities under a common umbrella. This directly challenges rigid older management concepts like unity of command, where everyone must have the exact same understanding.
That's fascinating. But if everyone is interpreting the goal slightly differently, how does the organization maintain cohesion? How does anything get done consistently?
That's the beauty and the challenge of the concept. Think about that classic example from Deborah Meyerson's study of hospital social workers. They all shared a common general purpose, patient welfare. But the sheer ambiguity and stress of their role within a complex, often conflicting hospital environment led them to use very different therapeutic techniques and approaches, even when dealing with similar patient problems.
So diversity in practice.
Exactly. And crucially, Meyerson found that when the hospital culture accommodated this ambiguity, when it didn't try to force every social worker into one single rigid best practice protocol, it actually reduced burnout and allowed for more adaptive, creative, localized problem solving. The ambiguity was functional.
So enactment theory really gives the organization, or its members, a powerful, creative role in shaping their own experienced reality.
Absolutely. Rather than simply reacting passively to external constraints, they are actively involved in constructing the world they inhabit through their interpretations and actions. It's a profoundly different view of the organization-environment relationship. Now, postmodernism takes this idea of social construction, which is inherent in symbolic theory, and pushes the analysis towards a much more critical, sometimes radical conclusion.
The goal here is less about understanding adaptation for survival within the current system,
And more about advocating for fundamental change. This is often achieved by questioning, challenging, and deconstructing the underlying values and power structures that define modern organizational life and its relationship with the environment.
To understand this critique, it helps to contextualize the historical shift that led us here. You mentioned Tom Burns described 3 phases of industrialization.
Yes, it's a useful framework. Phase 1 brought the factory system. Machines extending productivity, replacing independent subcontractors with foremen managing workers doing simple, repetitive tasks. Think of the early British textile industry. This established rigid hierarchies, often based on existing social status and gender roles.
Then phase 2, starting around the mid-19th century.
This saw industrialization diffuse into more complex industries, steel, engineering, chemicals. This demanded more sophisticated organization, bureaucracy, centralized control, functional specialization.
Leading to the rise of professional managers, clerical staff.
Exactly as thinkers like Max Weber on bureaucracy and Karl Marx on capital and labor had theorized would happen, the rise of the managerial class.
But phase 3, after World War II, marked another major shift.
It did. Production capacity in many sectors finally caught up with and even exceeded basic consumer demand. So the focus fundamentally shifted away from pure production efficiency
Towards things like consumer sensitivity, marketing, research and development, R&D, and rapid internationalization.
And this drove the need for much greater organizational flexibility, innovation, and a customer-oriented focus, paving the way for the next structural transformation.
Which leads directly to the idea of the post-industrial society.
A concept most famously formalized by sociologist Daniel Bell. He argued that while the industrial age was organized around controlling physical labor for the mass production of goods,
the post-industrial era is organized primarily around the creation, processing, and control of knowledge and information.
This shift predicted the explosive rise of the service sector, the increasing dominance of knowledge workers, and, as other commentators like John Naisbitt noted, the decline of rigid hierarchies in favor of more fluid communication networks. Information flows become paramount.
The contrast between industrial and post-industrial are really stark when laid out.
They are. The environment shifts from relatively stable, regulated nation-states to much more dynamic, fragmented, global competition.
Technology moves from fixed mass production lines
to flexible manufacturing systems, customization, things like just-in-time JIT production.
And the dominant social structure shifts from rigid bureaucracy
to flatter, horizontal networks, project teams, alliances, characterized by a concept we now call boundarylessness.
Boundarylessness. Tell us more about that.
It's perhaps the defining feature of many archetypal post-industrial organizational forms, strategic alliances, virtual organizations, network structures. Their boundaries, both internal and external, become much more permeable, flexible, sometimes almost irrelevant.
Internally how?
Through things like cross-functional teams, blurring traditional departmental lines, project-based work that assembles and disassembles teams quickly.
And externally?
Externally, the lines blur as organizations collaborate intensely with suppliers, customers, even competitors. The interests of the organization and its key stakeholders frequently overlap and intertwine in complex ways.
This blurring of external boundaries connects directly to stakeholder theory, doesn't it? Popularized by R. Edward Freeman.
Absolutely central. Freeman's core argument is that corporations operate via an implicit social contract with society as a whole, not merely a narrow fiduciary duty just to shareholders.
So corporate governance has to expand its focus.
It must. Beyond simple wealth maximization for owners, it must include the legitimate demands, interests, and welfare of all stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, suppliers, and, yes, the environment itself.
This creates an immediate ethical obligation that goes beyond just following the law.
It really does. It demands that organizations proactively avoid harm, act responsibly, and focus centrally on long-term sustainability, not just short-term profit.
And we have some fantastic organizational examples of this ethical shift in practice.
We do. Consider Interface, the global floor covering manufacturer. Its founder and CEO, Ray Anderson, had an epiphany, deciding his company had been, in his words, a plunderer of the earth.
And they completely transformed their business model.
Radically. Aiming for zero environmental footprint, pioneering sustainable manufacturing processes, becoming a global standard bearer for corporate environmental responsibility, it shows it's possible.
Or Novo Nordisk, the pharmaceutical giant.
Another great example. They voluntarily adopted triple bottom line accounting years ago, rigorously reporting not just on economic performance, but also on their environmental and social performance, holding themselves publicly accountable across all 3 dimensions.
Okay, so if we bring all these different theoretical lenses together, modern, symbolic, postmodern, what is the final compelling argument of the postmodern critique itself? What should the contemporary manager or analyst take away from it?
Well, postmodernism encourages us, perhaps even requires us, to adopt a deep skepticism towards the grand overarching narratives of modern theory, like contingency or resource dependence.
Why? Because they disguise power.
Precisely. Postmodernists argue these theories often implicitly or explicitly disguise underlying power dynamics and perpetuate existing forms of dominance. This leads us to the critical concept of hegemony.
Hegemony. Explain that.
It's a subtle but powerful form of domination. It occurs when the interests, values, and worldview of the ruling class, or, in our context, the most powerful organizations or institutional actors become so deeply embedded and widely accepted that they are seen as the natural, inevitable common sense status quo. They become unquestioned.
And postmodernists argue that modern organizational discourses often do this.
Yes. For example, constantly using the seemingly neutral logic of efficiency, rationality, or shareholder value can, from a critical perspective, conceal hegemonic intentions.
Such
Such as justifying global resource exploitation, driving down wages, ignoring environmental costs, or suppressing labor rights, all under the banner of economic necessity or competitiveness. Deconstruction is the critical act of peeling back that language to reveal the power plays and the often hidden ethical compromises.
And a key postmodern tool for doing this is linguistic deconstruction.
Yes, challenging the very language we use to define reality, identity, and organizations themselves. Language isn't neutral. It shapes perception and reinforces power structures.
Can you give an example?
Think about the historical shift in terminology from the label Third World, with all its connotations of backwardness and hierarchy.
To terms like developing world or global south.
Exactly. While imperfect, these newer terms attempt to symbolically equalize the participants in global discourse, challenging existing hierarchies of dominance and subtly unleashing transformative political potential simply by changing the definition, changing the language we use.
And Paul Srivastava applied this specifically to how organizations talk about the environment. Environmental deconstruction.
He did.
Yeah.
He argued very powerfully that the dominant modernist discourse systematically denatures the natural environment. It reduces nature to nothing more than a bundle of resources to be exploited, managed, bought, and sold.
And by prioritizing purely capitalistic concerns, markets, competition, resource extraction.
This discourse systematically silences or marginalizes crucial concerns for long-term sustainability, ecological health, biodiversity, and intergenerational equity. Postmodernists, therefore, call for a radical shift, placing nature, ethics, and sustainability at the very center of organizational discourse and decision-making, not leaving them as peripheral concerns or mere PR exercises. Hashtag outro, synthesis, and final thought. So we have covered a really wide spectrum in this deep dive, haven't we? A comprehensive examination of the organizational environment through multiple theoretical lenses.
We have. We saw the objective constraints and the, well, almost determinism inherent in population ecology and parts of institutional theory.
Perspectives where the environment is seen to largely select, shape, and constrain the organization. Survival depends on fitting in or being chosen.
But then we rigorously contrasted this with a strong belief in managerial agency, the ability to act, reflected in resource dependence theory.
And the even more radical conceptual creativity proposed by enactment theory, where the organization actively shapes, negotiates, or even creates its own perceived reality through interpretation and sense-making.
It's crucial to remember, isn't it, that these theoretical categories, modern, symbolic, postmodern, they aren't meant to be rigid, mutually exclusive boxes or fixed solutions cast in stone.
Not at all. They are best thought of as conceptual templates, different sets of lenses designed to stimulate and structure your analysis of complex situations.
So the most effective approach for you, the advanced learner listening to this, is probably to use multiple levels and perspectives simultaneously.
Definitely. Compare the insights you get from mapping resource dependencies against the institutional pressures for legitimacy, acting on that very same organization or in that field. Look for the tensions, the contradictions.
Look for the genuine analytical surprises, the richer understanding that emerges from the juxtaposition of these different theoretical viewpoints.
Because, in essence, all organizations are dynamic, ongoing works of enactment, interpretation, and social sense-making, and they are always inherently more complex, more ambiguous, more contradictory than our neat, abstract models can ever fully capture.
Which brings us neatly to our final provocative thought for this deep dive. Perhaps the central message from the postmodern critique, when applied constructively, isn't really nihilism or despair.
No, I think it's a call to adopt a healthy, critical skepticism. Skepticism about all static structures, all taken for granted assumptions, all embedded theoretical biases, including our own.
So the ultimate goal then in this complex field of organization-environment relations is perhaps developing self-reflexivity.
Constantly asking ourselves, whose voice might be silenced by the particular analytical categories or theories we choose to employ in our study or in our management practice? What unconscious values, what power dynamics are being prioritized or hidden by the definition of reality we decide to enact or accept in our organization? That ongoing critical reflection is key.